Thanks for coming out tonight. As Shane mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education, which sounds very grand until you come to inspect my pay stub, and then you realize it's more utility and fielding. Be that as it may, NCSC is a nonprofit organization that works to defend the teaching of evolution in public schools. And it is, I'm afraid, often in need of defense. So for teachers, parents, concerned citizens in general who are facing attacks on evolution education in their local communities or in their states, NCSC serves as a crisis clinic. And there's the office. That's my on the left. So it's been a good time recently for fans of science education and friends of evolution in the Sacramento area. Not only did we, right here in Carmichael, celebrate Darwin Day on February 7th, those of us who weren't watching the Super Bowl, but also many of us recently got to catch one or another of the talks that P.Z. Myers was giving on his Whirlwind California tour. Can I show of hands how many people saw P.Z. Myers? Oh, very good. If you don't know who P.Z. is, he's a biologist in Minnesota and a popular science blogger and a friend of all cephalopods. And an all-around good guy. That's him there. And here he is in action against a creationist. Now, in his talk in Davis, at any rate, PZ had a very nice and economical device for organizing his talk. He presented a bunch of adjectives: puerile and arrogant and saponaceous. Okay, not saponaceous. I wasn't taking notes. And he told anecdotes in which creationists conveniently exemplified the corresponding attributes. One story shows them being arrogant, another shows them being puerile, and so forth. And this was all well and good, but it struck me that he never really explained why we should be concerned about those particular instances of puerility and arrogance and saponaceousness, when after all, those are qualities that we see exemplified all about us. So it's kind of left to me to fill in the gap, I think. So where did creationism, with all its puerility and arrogance and saponaceousness, come from, and why should we be concerned about it, and what are its prospects? We could begin at the beginning, which, as we know, is 4004 BC. But in honor of Darwin's 201st birthday last Friday, let's begin with him, seen here at ages 7, 31, and 71, respectively. Now, the seeds of Darwin's greatness were readily apparent. As his father told him when he was a student at Edinburgh University studying medicine, you care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all of you. I can't do a big slide. Okay, well, it's true. Darwin came from a good and wealthy family, and he was clearly interested in nature from a young age, but he didn't show a lot of signs of promise of greatness. He wasn't a happy medical student, couldn't stand the sight of blood, and remember, this is pre-anesthesia. He wasn't too keen about all the screaming either. And he soon transferred to Cambridge University to study for the church. Conventionally religious at the time, nonetheless, his interest in an ecclesiastical career was primarily motivated by the thought that would leave him plenty of spare time to pursue his avocations of hunting and botanizing and beetle catching. At Cambridge, though, Darwin met and impressed some of the best scientific minds of his time, and then his chance came. On returning home from a short geological tour in North Wales, he found a letter from one of his Cambridge tutors informing him that a Captain Fitzroy was willing to give a part of his own cabin to any young man who would volunteer to go with him, without pay, on a long voyage on the Beagle, doing a surveying job in South America. It was a post perfect for a budding naturalist, and after some negotiations both with his family and with Fitzroy, who had reservations about taking Darwin because he didn't like the shape of his nose. After these negotiations, they set sail. Now, that's the Beagle in South America, I believe. And the Beagle was to circumnavigate the world over the course of 5 years with Darwin and Fitzroy. That's Fitzroy up on the right later in his career, which is why he has the fancy uniform. Both of them on board, and Darwin being seasick most of the time. That didn't prevent him from doing a tremendous amount of scientific work in the 5 years he spent on board, and on his return to England, he continued to work. In the mid-1830s, mulling over his hard-won geological and biological knowledge, he was already getting the glimmerings of an idea. That species of living things were not separately created, but were instead genealogically related in a tree of life, as you see from this page from his 1837 notebook. And moreover, that speciation was driven by a force that he was to call natural selection. Darwin was a cautious man. He realized that these ideas would shake up not only biology, but also science, owing to their implications for religious views, and he wasn't about to rush into print. Instead, he chose to focus in on a particular narrow area of science, barnacles. Darwin became consumed with barnacle research, and soon had naturalists from all over the world sending him their collections to examine. He toyed with the idea of publishing a grand work on barnacles. Such a study was very much needed by the scientific community, or at any rate that portion of it interested in barnacles. But of course there were ulterior motives for publishing such a treatise. Darwin felt that he needed to establish his bona fides as an expert on species variations before he published his work on the translocation of species, and the humble barnacle he thought would do the trick. He spent years on it, eventually telling a correspondent, "I hate a barnacle as no man ever did before." Not even a sailor on a slow-sailing ship. So central were barnacles to his life in the 1840s that an anecdote tells of one of Darwin's children visiting a neighbor's house, being shown all around, and then asking puzzledly, "But where does your father do his barnacles?" Well, Darwin's work continued apace, despite his ill health and a number of family tragedies, including the death of his beloved daughter Anne. In 1853, he received the Royal Medal of the Royal Society, the highest honor that the society could bestow on a scientist. An interesting thing to keep in mind when creationists tell you that he was a mediocre scientist 6 years before the origin is already receiving this honor. His thinking about evolution was progressing too, on the quiet, and in the 1850s he was increasingly discussing it with trusted colleagues. And then a thunderbolt. Darwin received a letter from a young naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, then in the Malay Archipelago, articulating the theory of evolution through natural selection, the very same idea that Darwin had been quietly nursing for himself since the 1840s. That, by the way, is Wallace. His photograph, in old age, appears on the cover of a recent edition of Darwin's autobiography. If you see this in the bookstore, snap it up, because the publisher was very embarrassed and had to recall it.